When she gave up her seat to an elderly woman on the bus, Sophie heard her say, "When your husband gives you a necklace, leave it overnight in a glass of water." At the time, she didn't give it much thought, but days later when her husband actually brought her a necklace, Sophie remembered the warning and dropped it into a glass of water. Sophie closed the accounting folder, turned off her monitor, and stretched in her chair, easing the tension in her stiff neck. It was 5 minutes to 6. Time to go. Through the window of the construction company's office, located in the industrial outskirts of Chicago, the asphalt was already growing dark. The end of the year was steadily stealing the last few hours of daylight. On the windowsill sat a yellowing fern they always forgot to water, and a mug with the dregs of a cold latte, her third of the day. She locked the documents in the safe, checked that the deadbolt was secured, and pulled her purse from under the desk, a worn brown leather tote she had been carrying for about 5 years. Buying a new one was always something she put off for later. Plus, to be honest, the money just wasn't there. An accountant's salary at a small suburban firm wasn't exactly the kind of money that allowed for luxuries. The hallway smelled of dampness and bleach. The cleaning lady Brenda had already mopped the first-floor linoleum. Sophie gave her a tired wave as she passed, pushed open the heavy front door, and stepped out onto the street. The freezing wind coming off Lake Michigan hit her face like a blade. She pulled up the collar of her wool coat and walked briskly to the bus stop. A 7-minute trek along the concrete wall of the industrial park, followed by a dash across the crosswalk, and there was the stop, featuring a crooked transit shelter and a schedule that no one had bothered to check in years. The CTA Route 17 bus operated according to its own mysterious logic, which rarely coincided with any official timetable. Sophie knew the route by heart every single workday. 5 days a week for the last 3 years, from the office to her stop in Elmwood Park. It was a 35-minute ride without traffic. With traffic, and at this time of year, there was always traffic, it took 50 minutes, sometimes an hour. She had long since stopped getting irritated by it, just as she had stopped getting irritated by so many other things in her life. A few people were already waiting at the shelter, a woman hauling heavy Jewel Osco grocery bags, 2 teenagers with backpacks, and an older man in a baseball cap staring at his smartphone. Sophie stood slightly apart and pulled out her own phone out of habit, not because she was expecting anything important. There were no messages. After all, who was going to text her? Her only close friend Lucy had moved to Florida in the spring to live with her sister, closer to the ocean and the warmth. They called each other occasionally, but with decreasing frequency. Lucy was adapting to her new home. She had her own routines, her own conversations, her own life. Sophie didn't resent her. It just became harder with each passing month to dial her number and offer anything beyond a sigh, and everything's pretty much the same here. The bus arrived 12 minutes later, a long blue and white vehicle with fogged-up windows and doors that screeched desperately as they opened. Sophie pushed her way inside and immediately realized she wouldn't be sitting down. There were no empty seats. She grabbed the overhead bar, pressed her tote bag against her side, and braced herself for a long commute standing up. The bus lurched forward and merged into traffic. Sophie swayed, barely keeping her balance. Familiar streets rolled past the condensation-streaked glass, closed newsstands, the neon cross of an all-night pharmacy. The dark, bare silhouettes of trees lining the boulevard. She stared out the window, reminding herself that she needed to buy potatoes and onions, and thinking that Mark probably hadn't taken out the trash. She had asked him to do it that morning. He had nodded, but that gesture of his no longer meant anything. Mark. When she thought of her husband, Sophie felt neither irritation nor warmth, but rather a dense, familiar weight, like carrying a heavy backpack for so long that you stop noticing the strain even though your back still aches. They had met 5 years ago. Mutual friends had invited them to a birthday party at a downtown apartment, a place packed with people, music thumping from a Bluetooth speaker, loud conversations out on the balcony. Sophie was 32 then, and had almost given up hoping someone would enter her life. It wasn't that she considered herself unattractive. It was just that her routine rarely strayed from the path between work and home, occasionally catching a movie with Lucy, or having coffee at a neighbor's. It was a closed loop where men simply didn't stick around, but Mark stayed. He was 2 years older, tall with dark hair, and a mole on his right cheek that gave him an air of boyish charm. He wasn't a great conversationalist, but he was precise. He had a gift for saying exactly what the other person needed to hear. That night, he sat next to her in the kitchen long after the crowd had thinned out, and they spent 2 hours talking about work plans and the general strangeness of life. He was working as a manager at a car dealership back then, and he spoke about it with a charming, self-deprecating humor. Sophie laughed. She hadn't laughed like that in a long time. A month later, they started dating. 6 months after that, they had a quiet courthouse wedding with no grand reception. Lucy was her maid of honor. Mark's buddy Charlie was his best man. After City Hall, the four of them sat in a cozy bistro. Mark ordered a bottle of champagne and raised a toast that brought tears to Sophie's eyes. To having found you late but for good. The first year was nice. Mark would come home from work and occasionally bring her cheap grocery store flowers, but she loved them anyway. On weekends, they cooked together and made plans. He talked about opening his own business, something related to auto parts. Sophie listened, believed in him, supported him. She liked having someone near to share the evenings with, not having to return to an empty apartment. Then something slowly began to change. It was almost imperceptible, like a hairline crack in a wall, that you initially mistake for a shadow. Mark quit his job at the dealership. "I found something better," he said. Sophie didn't ask questions. She assumed her husband knew what he was doing. The better option turned out to be a fly-by-night startup that folded 2 months later. Then came something else, selling God knows what online, endless talk of a partnership with some guy named Steve, whom Sophie never actually met. Every time Mark had an excuse. "It's temporary. I'm looking. The market is tough right now. I just need to find my niche." Months went by, and the niche never materialized. Mark spent more and more time at his computer. Websites, YouTube, rabbit holes, endless WhatsApp chats. Sometimes he went out for meetings and came back in an unpredictable mood. Sometimes he was euphoric, sometimes deeply sullen. He didn't bring any money home. Occasionally, he picked up odd jobs, helping someone move or assembling IKEA furniture for people on TaskRabbit. But these were meager earnings that he almost always spent on himself. Sophie carried the entire household on her shoulders. The mortgage, the groceries, the daily bills, all of it coming out of her accountant's salary, which seemed to shrink in purchasing power every year. She didn't make a scene, she didn't issue ultimatums. Maybe she should have, but she had been raised in a family where women endured. Her mother had endured her father. Her grandmother had endured her grandfather. It was considered normal not because they were weak, but because they believed that was just how things were. Family is family. For better or for worse. The only real asset Sophie possessed was the property, a plot of land with a sturdy brick cabin in Fox Lake, a scenic village an hour and a half away from the city right by the water. Her grandmother, Eleanor, had left her the house in her will. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 years prior at the age of 83. Sophie had cried so hard she couldn't even speak at the funeral. Grandma Eleanor was more than just a grandmother to her. She was an anchor, a pillar of support, someone she could visit at any time and just sit with on the porch sipping a hot mug of chamomile tea. The lake house meant childhood summer vacations, the smell of damp earth and pine needles, Grandma's homemade apple butter simmering in a pot on the stove, the creak of the front gate, the tabby cat from next door that would sprawl on the AP porch squinting in the sun. All of that was in the past now. The house was still standing, the old apple trees were still growing, but Grandma wasn't there anymore. The land in Fox Lake was appreciating in value every year. Neighboring plots were already selling for considerable. The area was developing. They had paved a proper road connecting it to the highway, and developers were building luxury subdivisions nearby. Sophie had a rough idea of what her property was worth, but the number didn't interest her. She had absolutely no intention of selling. Mark, however, did. He first brought it up about 6 months after Eleanor's death. At first he did it carefully, casually, Sophie, I was thinking. We hardly ever go up to the lake house. It's just sitting there, and we're just paying the property taxes. If we sold it, we could invest the money into something productive. I've been looking at a business opportunity. If we just had some seed money. Sophie silently shook her head and walked into the kitchen. Mark didn't press the issue then, but a few months later he brought it up again, this time more directly. Look, I've been doing some research. Lots in Fox Lake are going for $350,000 minimum. With the house on it, we could easily get $500,000 if we find the right buyer. That's real money, Sophie. We could. No, she said, cutting him off, offering no explanations. But why? Be reasonable. The house is sitting empty anyway. It's going to start falling apart. And the maintenance. I said, no, Mark. It's Grandma's house. I am not selling it. He fell silent, but she saw a muscle feather in his jaw. He interlaced his fingers over his knees and turned to look out the window. The matter was settled, but, as she would later discover, it was only settled for Sophie. Mark stopped bringing it up directly, but he would occasionally drop passive-aggressive remarks. If we had a decent financial cushion, like a piece of real estate, we could liquidate. Other people would have moved into a nicer condo ages ago. Sophie let it slide. She thought he was just complaining. She didn't know that he had long since moved past merely complaining. On that freezing evening, the bus crawled through the evening gridlock, stopping at every red light. Sophie stood near the rear doors, clutching the metal pole and counting the stops. 3 stops before hers, the man sitting in front of her stood up and headed for the exit. Sophie sank into the vacated seat, a cold, molded plastic shell with a sunken center, and stretched her legs. Her lower back hummed with pain after a full day in an office chair. At the next stop, the pneumatic doors hissed open, and an elderly woman boarded the bus. She was short and petite, wearing a long gray winter coat and a dark green wool beret. She looked to be in her 70s, maybe older. She climbed the steps, gripping the handrail tightly, and looked around. There were no empty seats. Sophie stood up without a second thought. It was automatic. She always did it. Since she was a little girl, Grandma Eleanor had taught her, if a senior citizen is standing on public transit, you get up. No overthinking, no internal debate, you just get up. Here, please have a seat, Sophie said, stepping aside. The old woman looked at her and smiled gratefully, not a broad smile, but a warm one entirely in her eyes, and sat down. Sophie returned to the metal pole and braced herself. Nothing special. An ordinary evening on an ordinary bus. 3 stops went by. The bus slowly emptied out. People disembarked, and the suffocating crush of the rush hour began to dissipate. Sophie started getting ready for her stop. She shifted her tote bag to her other shoulder, dug her transit card out of her pocket, and then felt a light tap on her elbow. She turned around. The old woman in the green beret was looking up at her. Her eyes, contrary to what Sophie might expect from someone her age, were not watery or clouded. They were clear, sharp, and intensely focused, as if she weren't just looking at Sophie but seeing something completely inaccessible to everyone else. "Listen to me carefully, my child," the woman said in a low voice, leaning in slightly so close that Sophie caught a faint scent of lavender and peppermint. "When your husband gives you a necklace, do not wear it. Leave it overnight in a glass of water." "Do you trust me?" Sophie froze. Her grip on the metal pole tightened. She instinctively took a half-step back, staring at the old woman, trying to process the words. Was this a prank? A hidden camera show? Maybe the woman had confused her with someone else? What necklace? What glass of water? Mark hadn't given her a gift in 2 years. For her last birthday, he had brought home a cheap bouquet from the corner bodega, 5 carnations wrapped in cellophane without even a signed card. And before that, Sophie couldn't even remember the last time he had given her anything that could reasonably be called a gift. "I'm sorry," Sophie said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I think you have me confused with someone else." The old woman slowly shook her head. The movement was calm and absolutely certain. She harbored no doubts. "I am not confusing you, Sophie. Just remember a glass of water overnight." She had called her by her name. Sophie felt a chill run down her spine, a small, unpleasant shiver like an icy draft under a door. She opened her mouth to ask how the woman knew her name, but at that exact moment, the bus jerked to a halt, and an automated metallic voice announced over the loudspeaker Elmwood Park Station. The doors hissed open. Sophie took a step toward the exit, put one foot on the icy sidewalk, and immediately spun around, looking back inside the bus. The old woman was sitting perfectly still, her hands neatly folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. Not at Sophie, but at a fixed point in the distance, as if no conversation had ever taken place between them. As if nothing had happened. The doors slammed shut. The bus pulled away, its red taillights bleeding into the darkness and the falling snow. Sophie stood frozen at the bus stop for several seconds, unable to move. Then she adjusted the strap of her tote bag and started walking toward her apartment, cutting through the courtyard, walking past the playground with its peeling slide and the swings that creaked faintly in the wind. Her 5-story brick walk-up sat at the back of the courtyard, surrounded by bare oak trees. 3rd floor, apartment 3B. She climbed the stairs, the building had no elevator, and unlocked the door. The entryway light was on. Mark's winter jacket hung on the rack. A constant low murmur emanated from the spare bedroom. The computer, as always. "Hey," Sophie called out to the empty hallway as she kicked off her snow-dampened boots. "Hey," Mark replied from somewhere deep inside the apartment. His voice sounded distracted, entirely absent. Sophie walked into the kitchen. The trash can was overflowing. She silently pulled the bag out, tied it off, and left it by the back door. Then she opened the fridge, mostly empty shelves, a wedge of cheddar drying out in its plastic wrap, an open jar of pickles, a half-gallon of milk, half a carton of eggs. She grabbed the eggs and put a frying pan on the stove. While the eggs sizzled, Sophie stood staring out the kitchen window into the courtyard. The street lamp outside illuminated a freezing puddle that reflected a sliver of the dark Chicago sky. And again, like a broken record, the voice echoed in her head. "I am not confusing you, Sophie. A glass of water overnight." How did that woman know her name? Sophie was absolutely certain she had never seen her before. The face was completely unfamiliar. She didn't recognize the voice. Maybe the old woman had some connection to her grandmother. Fox Lake was a small community. Everyone knew everyone. But Sophie couldn't recall anyone looking like her among Grandma Eleanor's friends, though to be fair, she hadn't visited as often as she should have in those final years. Work the commute, Mark. Life got in the way. At dinner, if 2 fried eggs with toast and a cup of tea could be called dinner, Mark sat across from her, scrolling through his phone without once looking up. Sophie wanted to tell him about the old lady. The words were right on the tip of her tongue. "You won't believe what happened on the bus today." But she stopped. Something held her back. Not fear or suspicion, but a vague intuition that this conversation wasn't meant for Mark. He would just brush it off with a dismissive wave. He would say, "The old bat's crazy," and go back to his screen. And logically, he'd be right. An unknown old woman on a city bus giving cryptic advice. The city was full of crazy people, but Sophie didn't say a word. She cleared the plates, scrubbed the pan, wiped down the counter. Mark retreated to his computer. She went to bed, turned off the lamp, and lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Through the drywall, the muffled sound of a YouTube video droned on. Mark was watching something late into the night. "When your husband gives you a necklace." Sophie rolled onto her side, pulled the comforter up to her chin, and tried to sleep. What necklace? Mark wasn't going to give her a necklace. He hadn't even bought her a candy bar in 2 years. The old lady was either confused or just an eccentric weirdo. It happens. She closed her eyes and started counting her breaths. Eventually, she drifted off. A week passed. The bitter cold settled in for good. In the mornings, the puddles in the courtyard were covered in a thin layer of ice that melted into a freezing drizzle by the afternoon. Sophie went to work, took the same bus home, made dinner, and went to sleep, everything exactly as usual. The bizarre encounter on the bus gradually began to fade from her memory, like an old Polaroid left in the sun. The outlines were still visible, but the details were washing out. A couple of times, she caught herself remembering the old woman's piercing eyes and the scent of lavender, but she quickly shook it off. Nonsense. On a Thursday evening, a completely ordinary Thursday, nothing special about it, Sophie came home a little later than usual. There had been a line at the local grocery store. She had stood waiting for 15 minutes just to buy a bag of rice and a bottle of vegetable oil. She trudged up to the 3rd floor, jingled her keys, pushed the door open, and immediately noticed that something was different. The apartment smelled of cologne. Not yesterday's lingering scent, but fresh, sharp, and intense, as if someone had just sprayed it. Mark was standing in the hallway. He was freshly shaven, his jawline smooth and a little flushed, looking like he did back when they were first dating. He was wearing a dark blue button-down shirt with a subtle microprint. Sophie didn't immediately register why the shirt looked weird. Then it hit her. It was brand new. Never washed, still bearing the sharp, unnatural creases from the store packaging. When had he bought it? And more importantly, with what money? "Hey Sophie, come here," he said. His voice was different, softer than usual, coated with an inflection she hadn't heard in a long time. Maybe a year, maybe 2. It was the voice he used to charm her back when he wanted to impress her. She set the plastic grocery bag on a stool and slowly took off her winter coat, taking her time. Something inside her had pulled taut like a guitar string, even though she didn't yet know why. "What's going on?" she asked. "Nothing. I just have a little something for you." He extended his hand. Resting on his palm was a small, dark blue velvet box. The kind you get at a jewelry store. Sophie stood completely still, staring at it. For several seconds they remained frozen like that. He with his hand out. She with her damp scarf clutched in her fist. The hallway was dead silent, save for the ticking of the kitchen clock. "Take it," Mark urged. A flash of impatience sparked in his voice, quick like a shadow darting behind a window pane. "It won't bite." Sophie took the box. It was incredibly light, almost weightless. The velvet felt soft and unnervingly cold under her fingertips. "What is this?" she asked, though her hands were already popping the hinge open on their own. "I just wanted to do something nice. You work so hard you're always tired. I thought you deserved something beautiful." Inside, resting on a white satin cushion, lay a gold necklace. It was a fine, delicate chain with an elegant braid pattern. The clasp, however, was a bit bulkier than usual, featuring a small, rounded, cylindrical element that looked like a decorative bead. At first glance, it was simply a piece of jewelry. Nothing extraordinary. And in that exact fraction of a second, it hit Sophie. It wasn't just a thought. It was a physical sensation, like a heavy blow to the chest. The old woman's voice, that low, steady voice smelling of lavender. When your husband gives you a necklace, do not wear it. Leave it overnight in a glass of water. Her fingers trembled. The box nearly slipped from her grasp. Sophie gripped it tighter and forced herself to look up at Mark. He was watching her expectantly, a faint smile on his lips, his head tilted slightly like a dog waiting for its owner to throw a ball. She should have said thank you. She should have smiled, put the necklace on, given him a kiss on the cheek. That's what wives do when their husbands surprise them with jewelry. It would have been the normal thing to do. But normal had left the building, because it was Thursday. Because it wasn't her birthday, or their anniversary, or Valentine's Day. Because the man who hadn't bought her a box of chocolates in 2 years was standing there in a brand new shirt drenched in cologne handing her a gold necklace. Because the old woman on the bus had known her name. Sophie smiled. The smile cost her immense effort, as if her facial muscles had forgotten the movement and had to be taught how to do it on the fly. It's beautiful. Thank you, Mark. I'll wear it tomorrow to the office. It's late now, and I'm just in my sweats. Mark's face changed, very subtly for just a fraction of a second. The smile remained, but his eyes shifted. A glint of annoyance, of profound disappointment flashed through them. He clearly expected her to put it on right then and there in the hallway right in front of him. All right, whatever you want, he said, shoving his hands into his pockets. But wear it every day, okay? It'll look great on you. I picked it out specifically for you. Of course, Sophie nodded firmly. She carried the little velvet box into the bedroom, set it on the nightstand next to her alarm clock and the glass of water she always kept there. She closed the bedroom door, leaned her back against the wood, and stood there for a few seconds, pressing the palm of her hand against her chest. Her heart was hammering fast and irregular, like she had just sprinted up the stairs. She walked over to the nightstand, opened the box, and lifted the necklace out. She held it up to the light of the bedside lamp. The necklace looked completely normal. The gold braid was flawless and shiny. The clasp was slightly more robust than what you'd usually find on such a delicate chain, specifically because of that rounded element. Sophie rubbed it between her thumb and index finger. It felt smooth, tightly sealed, with no obvious seams or suspicious details. It was just a clasp. So what was she looking for? What was she afraid of? An unknown old woman on a city bus had spouted some nonsense, and here she was standing in her bedroom inspecting her husband's gift, like a TSA agent examining a suspicious package. Sophie put the necklace back in the box. She changed into her pajamas, walked into the kitchen and put away the groceries, the rice in the pantry, the oil on the shelf. She filled the electric kettle and turned it on. Mark was in the spare room at his computer. Sophie could hear the muffled clicking of his mouse and his occasional coughing. She drank her tea while staring out the dark window. Freezing rain streaked the glass, distorting the glow of the courtyard street lamp. Her thoughts spun in circles like a malfunctioning carousel that someone forgot to unplug. Logic told her one thing. Forget it. Drop it. The old lady is a crackpot. A necklace is just a necklace. Be glad your husband actually thought of you for once. But something else, not logic, but something deeper stemming from the raw territory of intuition, from that dark basement of the subconscious, where the light of reason doesn't reach, told her something entirely different. Check it. The kettle clicked off. Sophie rinsed her mug, dried her hands, and listened. The faint audio of a video droned on from the spare room. Mark was occupied. She quietly opened an upper cabinet and took out a standard heavy glass, a thick mason jar-style glass they had owned for years. She filled it with tap water, walked back into the bedroom, took the necklace out of the box, and very carefully holding it with 2 fingers, lowered it into the water. The necklace drifted to the bottom. The golden chain uncoiled slightly in the liquid. The heavy clasp tilted to the side. Sophie covered the glass with a small saucer. She walked back to the kitchen, opened the bottom drawer of the cabinets, the one where she kept the heavy pots, a rusted cast-iron skillet, and baking sheets she hadn't touched in 3 years. She pushed the glass all the way to the deepest, darkest back corner, hiding it behind a large, chipped enamel pot. Mark never opened that drawer. In all their years together, not once. He didn't cook, and pots and pans didn't interest him. She slid the drawer shut, stood up, and looked at her hands. They were trembling slightly. Sophie balled them into fists, opened them, balled them up again, then flicked off the kitchen light and went to bed. Mark came to bed well past midnight. Sophie lay there with her eyes closed, listening to him undress in the dark, the mattress creaking under his weight, the rustle as he pulled up the comforter. Within a minute, his breathing evened out. He fell asleep quickly. He always did. She lay awake thinking about the glass of water in the bottom drawer, the gold necklace resting at the bottom, the ambient orange glow of the street lamp filtering through the blinds, and the terrifying fact that in the morning she would have to look inside that glass. She didn't fall asleep until the early hours of the morning, maybe 4, maybe 5. Her sleep was fragmented, oppressive, and dreamless. The alarm went off at 6:30 a.m. Sophie opened her eyes and lay staring at the ceiling for a few seconds. Beside her, Mark was fast asleep on his side, facing the wall, the blankets slipping off his shoulder. She slipped out of bed quietly, threw on her fleece robe, and walked out of the bedroom, easing the door shut behind her. The kitchen was freezing and gray. The damp chill of the Chicago dawn seeped through the window panes. Sophie turned on the coffee maker, then stood completely still for about 10 seconds, her hand hovering over the handle of the bottom drawer, terrified to pull it. A stupid, childish thought circled her mind. As long as I don't open the drawer, everything can still be okay. As long as I don't look, the necklace is just a necklace, the water is just water, and I can just keep living my life. She pulled the handle. The drawer rolled open with a squeak. The glass was exactly where she had left it, tucked behind the enamel pot covered by the saucer. Sophie grabbed it with both hands, lifted it to eye level, and carried it over to the window where the morning light was slightly stronger. The water was cloudy. Not just slightly hazy, not just a little murky. It was violently, thickly clouded, tinted with a dirty, sickly yellowish hue that does not happen when you soak regular metal. At the bottom lay the necklace. And right next to the clasp, Sophie saw something that absolutely had not been there the night before. That decorative rounded element on the clasp, the smooth little cylinder she had assumed was just a bulky design choice, had slid open. It had shifted on a microscopic track, revealing a tiny, hollowed-out cavity, like a miniature hidden compartment. From that cavity, a viscous, cloudy substance had bled out into the water, expanding into a dirty, suspended cloud. And floating right next to it were the gelatinous, swollen, semi-transparent remains of something else. Sophie didn't understand what it was at first. Then it dawned on her. A pill capsule. A gelatin capsule identical to the kind used for medication, only incredibly tiny. It had been packed tightly inside the hollowed clasp. Overnight, submerged in the water, the gelatin had dissolved, bursting open and releasing whatever had been hidden inside it. Sophie stood in her freezing kitchen barefoot in her old robe, holding the glass out with locked elbows, and suddenly couldn't breathe. It wasn't just fear. It was something far more massive than fear. It was a terrifying realization carving its way through her, slow and agonizing, like ice water filling her chest cavity. That necklace was supposed to be around her neck. That clasp was designed to rest directly against her skin. The thin, sensitive skin, at the nape of her neck, right where the blood vessels run close to the surface, right where the body is warmest. And that gelatin capsule was supposed to dissolve, not in a glass of tap water, but melted by her own body heat. Slowly. Day after day. The coffee maker beeped loudly, signaling it was done. Sophie jumped. She set the glass down on the counter. Her hands were shaking violently, now a fine, uncontrollable tremor, as if she were burning up with a fever, though she was freezing cold. She stood frozen, staring at the cloudy, poisoned water, her brain firing rapidly, feverishly. Thoughts collided violently. Her first instinct was to dump it all down the sink, throw the necklace into the garbage disposal, grind it to dust, and try to forget the whole thing like a nightmare. Just pretend nothing ever happened. Her second instinct was to march into the bedroom, shake Mark awake, and smash the glass right across his face, screaming at him. "What is this? What did you do? What were you trying to do to me?" But Sophie did neither of those things. She stood perfectly still in her kitchen, and that same inner voice, the deep, primal instinct that had ordered her to test the necklace the night before, now whispered clearly, "Don't rush. Don't scream. Don't throw away the evidence. Think." She placed the saucer back on top of the glass. She carefully placed the glass inside a thick Ziploc bag and sealed it tight, trapping the water inside. Then, she placed the sealed bag deep inside her old brown leather tote. She went to the bathroom, washed her face, got dressed, and brushed her hair. Her movements were entirely mechanical, like a wind-up doll, but her hands had finally stopped shaking. From the bedroom, she heard a noise. Mark was waking up. Sophie listened to the bed creak, his heavy footsteps down the hall, the sound of the toilet flushing. A minute later, he shuffled into the kitchen, bleary-eyed, wearing a wrinkled undershirt and flannel pajama pants, rubbing his face. "You're up early," he mumbled through a yawn. "I have to get in early," Sophie replied, buttoning her coat. Her voice came out flat and steady. She surprised herself. "Quarterly close out. The boss wants the numbers on his desk by 9. Oh. Well, all right." Mark poured himself a cup of coffee. "Did you put the necklace on?" Sophie, who already had her hand on the front doorknob, paused for a fraction of a second, then turned around. Mark was looking at her over the rim of his ceramic mug. His gaze was incredibly sharp, not sleepy, not distracted, but intensely focused. He was staring directly at her bare neck. "Not yet," she said. "The clasp felt a little flimsy to me when I checked it this morning. I'm worried about it snapping and losing it at the office. I think I might take it to a jeweler just to have them reinforce it first." A shadow crossed Mark's face, fast like a ripple over a pond, vanishing instantly. He shrugged. "The clasp is fine, but whatever you want. Have a good day. I'm going to be late," Sophie said. She stepped out, closed the door behind her, and didn't let herself exhale until she was halfway down the stairs. She didn't go to work that day. Instead, she took the CTA train downtown, getting off near the city's medical district. She waited an hour in the walk-in clinic to see a general practitioner, not because she needed a doctor, but because she didn't know where else to turn. The doctor, a middle-aged woman with exhausted eyes, listened to Sophie's chaotic, breathless story. To Sophie's profound shock, the doctor didn't look at her like she belonged in a psych ward. Instead, she picked up her desk phone, made a brief call to a colleague, and scribbled an address on a prescription pad. "This is the Municipal Toxicology Laboratory," the doctor said. "They handle chemical and biological analysis. Go there right now. Give them the water and the jewelry. Tell them you need a full tox screen. They will have you fill out an intake form." Sophie went. The lab was located in an imposing brutalist concrete building on the west side of the city. The long, fluorescent-lit corridors smelled of bleach and sterile chemicals. She explained the situation to the clerk at the intake window, a young guy in a white lab coat who listened with alarming, practiced calm. She filled out the forms, pulled the Ziploc bag out of her tote, and handed it over. The technician took the glass out of the bag very carefully. He looked inside at the yellowed water and the dissolved gelatin, and Sophie noticed his eyebrows twitch upward for a split second. He didn't say a word. He just slapped a barcode sticker on a plastic specimen container, transferred the water and the necklace into it, and sealed it. "Results will take 3 to 4 business days," he told her. "Call this number or come back in person." 4 days. Sophie walked out of the lab and into the biting cold. She sat down on a concrete bench near the entrance and stayed there for 20 minutes, just watching the cars blur past on the avenue. Then she stood up and took the train home. She had to survive those 4 days, living side by side with Mark, as if absolutely nothing was wrong. And somehow, she did. She made dinner, macaroni and cheese, leftover chicken noodle soup, a cheap steak with potatoes. She sat on the couch watching Netflix, while Mark clicked his mouse in the other room. She got into bed with him, listened to him, breathed in the dark, and stared endlessly at the ceiling. Every morning, she got up, made coffee, and went to work. Everything exactly as usual. As if the world hadn't tilted on its axis. Mark asked about the necklace twice during those 4 days. The first time was over dinner, stabbing a piece of steak with his fork, trying to sound casual. "So, did you take it to the jeweler yet?" Sophie replied that she hadn't had the time. The second time was on Saturday morning while she was writing a grocery list. "Sophie, why aren't you wearing it? I went out of my way to find something nice." "I picked it out specifically for you. It actually kinda hurts my feelings that you won't even put it on." His voice was soft, playing the wounded husband perfectly, but Sophie caught that same rapid, probing look darting toward her neck, checking for the gold chain. "I promise I'll wear it next week," she lied smoothly. "I really will." He nodded, satisfied, and turned back to his laptop. On the 4th day, a Tuesday, Sophie asked to leave work early after her lunch break. She told her boss she had a doctor's appointment and took an Uber straight to the lab. The waiting room was empty save for the buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead. She gave the clerk her case number, and a few minutes later, he handed her a manila envelope. She opened it with numb, freezing fingers while sitting in a plastic chair against the wall. The report was printed on official city letterhead, stamped and signed by the head toxicologist. The text was dry, bureaucratic, and dense with chemical terminology, but the conclusion was impossible to misunderstand. Sophie grasped it immediately. The submitted liquid sample contains trace compounds of heavy metals, specifically thallium and lead, in concentrations significantly exceeding permissible limits for human exposure. In the event of prolonged dermal contact, particularly in vascular-dense regions such as the cervical spine neck, the substance is capable of gradual, sustained transdermal absorption into the bloodstream. The gelatinous residue indicates a delivery mechanism engineered for slow dissolution via human body heat. Sophie reread the last sentence 3 times. Engineered for slow dissolution via human body heat. Her body heat. The warmth of her own skin. That poison was supposed to melt onto her, seep into her pores, and quietly poison her from the inside out. Day after day, week after week, while she rode the CTA bus, while she cooked his dinner, while she slept right next to the man who was actively murdering her. She folded the report carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and put it in her purse. She stood up and walked out of the lab. The wind outside was vicious, whipping off the lake, but Sophie walked down the sidewalk without even zipping up her coat. She didn't feel the freezing rain, didn't notice the people bumping into her. She felt entirely hollowed out, yet impossibly heavy, like a house that had been completely emptied of furniture, but someone had left all the lights blazing. She didn't go home. She went straight to the Chicago Police Department precinct. The station was chaotic. On the other side of a frosted glass partition, 2 people were screaming at each other. Heavy doors slammed. Phones rang endlessly without being answered. Sophie sat on a hard wooden bench in the lobby, clutching her tote bag against her knees. The desk sergeant took his time calling someone down, but eventually she was escorted to a cluttered office on the 2nd floor. Detective Miller was young, maybe 32 at most, with a tight buzz cut, exhausted eyes, and a styrofoam cup of cold coffee, sitting dangerously close to a precarious stack of file folders. He offered her a chair and listened to her intently, never interrupting as Sophie laid out the entire story. She spoke calmly, chronologically, and with clinical precision. She was shocked by her own composure. The necklace, the water glass, the lab, the toxicologist's report. She pulled the envelope out of her bag and set the lab results on his desk, right next to the Ziploc bag containing the specimen jar the lab had returned to her. Detective Miller unfolded the report, read it in silence, and slowly looked up. "Ma'am, do you understand that this is a very, very serious accusation?" "I know," Sophie said, her voice steady. "That's why I brought the forensic evidence. I didn't just come here with a crazy story." He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. He pulled a formal complaint form from his desk drawer and handed her a black pen. Sophie wrote for nearly 45 minutes, her handwriting small and meticulous, filling out every single line. When she finished, Detective Miller reviewed the document. He asked a series of sharp, clarifying questions. "When exactly did he give you the necklace? How did he act afterward? Did he ask about it?" Sophie answered every question briefly and precisely. Miller took furious notes on a legal pad. "We are going to have to run an independent verification through the state crime lab," he told her. "It's standard procedure for a case like this. But we will open an active investigation immediately. For right now, I need you to go back home and act like everything is perfectly normal. Do not mention the police. Do not mention the lab report. Do not let on that you know anything. Can you do that?" "I can," Sophie said. And she realized it was the absolute truth. She had already been doing it for 4 days. The investigation moved much faster than she had anticipated. 3 days later, Miller called and asked her to come back to the precinct. He met her in the same cluttered office, though the stack of files had grown, and the coffee cup was now a chipped ceramic mug. "The state lab confirmed the city's findings," Miller said, leaning forward. "Thallium and lead. Highly toxic. Now we're looking into exactly where that necklace was modified. We subpoenaed security footage from every major and independent jeweler in the metro area. It took some digging, but we're narrowing the circle down." Sophie nodded, absorbed the information, and went back to her life. Time dragged on like thick molasses. She went to work, took the bus home, made dinner. Mark noticed nothing, or at least he played the part flawlessly. He had started asking about the necklace less frequently. Every now and then he'd toss out a casual comment while walking past her in the hallway. "So you still haven't put it on, huh?" And Sophie would calmly reply that she'd definitely get to it by the weekend. Every time she said it, she watched that dark, impatient shadow flicker across his eyes. A week later, Detective Miller called again. His tone was entirely different now. Hard-focused, professional. "We found the jewelry shop," he said. "It's a boutique place on Maple Avenue downtown. Security cameras show your husband speaking with the master jeweler 10 days before he gave you the necklace. We've already brought the jeweler in for questioning." Sophie went to the precinct that evening. Detective Miller laid out the details. The jeweler, a man in his 50s who had been in the business for over 20 years, stated that a client had walked in with a pre-purchased gold chain and asked for a highly unusual modification. He wanted a custom-built hollow cavity with a micro-hinged lid installed directly into the clasp, specifically sized to hold a small gelatin capsule. The jeweler said the client claimed it was for holistic herbs, Miller explained, reading from a transcript. He told the jeweler his wife suffered from chronic fatigue and anxiety, and a naturopathic doctor had recommended she wear these special herbs pressed directly against her skin. The jeweler didn't ask any more questions. It was a bizarre request, sure, but legally speaking, modifying a clasp isn't a crime. He did the work in 3 days and charged a premium rush fee. But here's where it gets interesting. Miller flipped a page in the file. The jeweler mentioned that while he was working on the piece at his bench, an old friend of his came into the shop. An older woman named Clara. She's a retired jeweler herself, used to do appraisals for the owner. She just dropped by to say hello, but she saw the modified clasp on the bench and asked about it. The jeweler told her the whole story, the capsule, the holistic herbs, the devoted husband. He even mentioned that the client's name was Mark, that his wife was always working and exhausted, and that they owned a lake house property in Fox Lake that they were planning to sell to start a new life. Miller looked up. The jeweler said Clara listened to all this, got very quiet, and just stood there staring at the photograph of the necklace the client had left behind. Sophie sat perfectly still. Something inside her mind was shifting, locking into place. It was like a jigsaw puzzle she had been fumbling with in the dark for weeks, suddenly illuminated. Clara, Sophie repeated slowly. An older woman, a retired jeweler. We haven't established a direct connection yet, Miller said, but we're looking for her. You don't have to, Sophie whispered. I think I know who she is. That very night, Sophie made a phone call. Not to Clara, she didn't have her number, but to Martha Grandma, Eleanor's next-door neighbor up in Fox Lake, the only person from the lake house she kept in her contacts. Martha picked up on the 4th ring, thrilled to hear from her. She immediately started scolding Sophie for never visiting the cabin anymore. Sophie cut her off politely, but urgently. Martha, did Grandma Eleanor have a close friend named Clara? There was a pause on the line. Then Martha chuckled. Sophie, honey, of course. Clara Carmichael. She was Eleanor's best friend. They knew each other for 40 years. They started out working the line at the old manufacturing plant together back in the 70s. Clara eventually left to become a jeweler downtown, and your grandma went into accounting, but they stayed thick as thieves right until the end. I remember when Eleanor got real sick toward the end, she used to tell Clara, if anything ever happens to my Sophie, you keep an eye out for her. And Clara swore up and down that she would. Sophie sat at her kitchen table, the phone pressed hard against her ear. The mosaic was complete. Every missing tile snapped into place. Clara had walked into the jewelry shop and seen a bizarre custom order. Her professional intuition, 40 years in the Diamond District, told her that packing holistic herbs into a gelatin capsule, hidden inside a necklace clasp, was highly suspicious. But she had no idea who the necklace was for. Then the jeweler, completely oblivious, spilled the details. The client was named Mark. His wife worked herself to the bone. They owned a cabin in Fox Lake. He was going to sell it so they could change their lives, and in the meantime, he wanted to treat his sick wife with herbs. Fox Lake. Mark. The wife. The property sale. It must have hit Clara like a freight train. She knew exactly who owned that house in Fox Lake. Eleanor had talked about it so much that Clara could probably draw a map of the apple trees in the yard, and she knew Sophie's husband was named Mark. Eleanor had mentioned him constantly in her final years, always with a tone of deep unease. Clara knew. She knew exactly what was happening. But what could she do? Go to the Chicago police. With what? A hunch. About some herbs. The client had supplied the capsule himself. The jeweler didn't actually know what was inside it. Technically, no laws had been broken yet. Should she call Sophie directly? How do you call a young woman you barely know and say, "Hi, your husband is building a murder weapon to poison you"? Sophie would have hung up and called a psychiatric hospital. She wouldn't have believed a word of it. So Clara did something else. She knew where Sophie lived. Eleanor had given her the address years ago for emergencies. She knew which bus route Sophie took home from work because Eleanor had always complained about her granddaughter spending hours stuck on the CTA Route 17. For 3 consecutive nights, Clara, a 70-year-old woman with bad arthritis in her knees, rode the freezing crowded Route 17 bus, transferring at different stops, scanning the exhausted faces of the commuters. On the 3rd night, she finally spotted Sophie, and she gave her the only piece of advice that had a chance of working. No accusations, no complex explanations, no panic. Just a simple concrete instruction. Drop the necklace in a glass of water. If the capsule contained something dangerous, the water would prove it. If it was harmless, nothing would happen and Sophie would just write her off as a crazy lady on the bus. Clara deliberately used Sophie's name so the encounter would stick in her mind so she couldn't dismiss it. She offered no further explanation, knowing that explanations breed skepticism, but mystery demands investigation. Sophie hung up the phone. She sat in the dark kitchen for a very long time, never turning on the lights. Outside, the street lamps flickered through the icy rain, sliding down the glass. For 3 freezing nights, an elderly woman had ridden a miserable city bus, searching for the granddaughter of her dead friend just to warn her. She had done it without knowing for sure if it was poison, risking looking completely insane, simply because she had made a promise to Eleanor. And she kept it. Mark was arrested 2 weeks after Sophie filed the initial report. Sophie didn't hear it from the detective. She heard it from the busybody neighbor across the hall who frantically called Sophie at work to tell her that an unmarked police cruiser had rolled into the courtyard and 2 plainclothes detectives had marched up to the 3rd floor, dragged Mark out in handcuffs. The neighbor was practically vibrating with gossip, but Sophie already knew it was happening. Detective Miller had called her briefly that morning. "We're executing the arrest and search warrants today. Do not go back to the apartment until tonight." And she didn't. She sat at her desk at the construction firm, staring at her Excel spreadsheets without processing a single number. Her hands rested on the keyboard, but her fingers didn't move. Her coworker Megan asked her twice if she was feeling okay. Sophie nodded and blamed a migraine. That evening, Detective Miller called and asked her to come down to the precinct. His voice was firm, but Sophie detected something new in it. Not exhaustion, but the heavy, grim satisfaction of a man who found exactly the monsters he was hunting for and took no joy in the discovery. In his office, Miller laid out the findings of the search warrant. They had seized Mark's computer. The search history over the last 6 months was damning. He had extensively researched transdermal poisoning, how toxic substances absorb through the human epidermis. He had read medical journal articles on the symptomology of chronic thallium toxicity. He had frequented dark web forums discussing untraceable heavy metal poisonings. He had typed specific queries into Google. How long does thallium exposure take to incapacitate and transdermal lead absorption via cervical spine? The searches weren't frantic. They were methodical, spread out over months, as if he were taking a college course on how to kill his wife. They also recovered chat logs from an encrypted messaging app. Using a burner handle, Mark had communicated with an anonymous vendor about purchasing a highly concentrated thallium compound. The transaction was masked as a purchase of scientific reagents. The package had been delivered to a generic Amazon locker a few months prior. But the most chilling piece of evidence wasn't on the computer. Hidden in the bottom drawer of his desk, buried under a stack of old car magazines, they found a printed quitclaim deed. Grantor Sophie. Grantee Mark. Property address: Fox Lake, Illinois. The legal document was completely filled out. The only thing missing was Sophie's signature on the dotted line. Right next to the deed sat a business card for a luxury real estate broker and a printed Zillow estimate. The property was valued at $500,000. The plan was designed to play out over several months, Miller said, closing the thick manila folder. He didn't want to kill you. At least not quickly. That would look too suspicious. The math was simple. With daily wear, the capsule would slowly dissolve from your body heat. Microdoses of thallium would enter your bloodstream through your neck. After a few weeks, the severe symptoms would start: chronic fatigue, crippling migraines, cognitive confusion, severe muscle weakness, eventually hair loss. Doctors would likely misdiagnose it as extreme stress or maybe early-onset MS. Miller looked her dead in the eye. In that state, physically broken, mentally incapacitated, terrified, and dependent on him, he calculated that you would sign that property transfer deed without putting up a fight. And once the house was in his name, he would sell it. Sophie listened, and she felt the last burning ember inside her finally completely extinguish. It wasn't rage. Her rage had burned itself out weeks ago. It wasn't fear. The fear was in the rearview mirror. Throughout the agonizing days of waiting, a tiny, pathetic spark had remained hidden deep inside her. A desperate hope that there had been a misunderstanding. That Mark wasn't actually capable of this. That spark was dead. He was capable. He had calculated everything. He found the poison. He found the jeweler he drafted. The legal documents he researched. The market value, $500,000. That was the price tag he had put on her life. Or rather, on her health, her sanity, and her ability to say no. During his interrogation, Mark initially denied everything. He claimed the necklace was just a loving gift, that he had never heard of thallium, that the web searches were just morbid curiosity from watching a true crime Netflix documentary. When Miller slammed the encrypted chat logs regarding the reagent purchase on the table, Mark went dead silent for 10 minutes, then pivoted. He claimed the capsule really did contain holistic herbs, that the state lab was grossly incompetent, that he just wanted to cure his wife's fatigue, but the mountain of evidence left him zero room to maneuver. 2 identical lab reports. The jeweler's sworn statement. Security camera footage. A browser history mapping out a premeditated poisoning. The dark web purchase receipts. The unexecuted quitclaim deed. The real estate broker's card. Any one piece could be argued. Together, they formed a steel trap that slammed shut on his life. He was indicted by a grand jury for attempted first-degree murder and aggravated battery with a deadly substance. Sophie filed for divorce that same week. The process was shockingly streamlined. Mark, sitting in the Cook County Jail awaiting trial, offered no contest. The paperwork was expedited, there were no assets to fight over, and she never had to see him in a courtroom. Sophie packed all of his belongings into heavy-duty black trash bags, loaded them into her car, and drove to his mother's house. The older woman opened the door, looked at the garbage bags on the porch, looked at Sophie's stone-cold face, and dragged the bags inside without uttering a single word. The apartment was suddenly vast and empty. Sophie walked through the rooms slowly, getting used to the profound silence. She disassembled Mark's computer desk and dragged the pieces out to the dumpster in the alley. In its place, she set up an antique reading lamp she had found in the hall closet, one that had belonged to Grandma Eleanor. In the evenings, she would turn it on, sit in the armchair, and read. For the first time in years, before she had never had the time or the energy, she managed to get Clara's phone number from Martha. She called her. Briefly, awkwardly, her voice shaking, she asked if they could meet. Clara accepted immediately, asking no questions. She only said, "Are you okay, Sophie?" Her voice broke slightly on the name. Sophie went to see her on a crisp Saturday morning, bringing a large bouquet of white carnations she had bought at the corner florist. Clara lived in a 4th-floor walk-up in Lincoln Park, in a cozy one-bedroom apartment, overflowing with bookshelves and pots of blooming African violets. The walls were covered in framed, yellowing black and white photographs. In one of them, Sophie immediately recognized her grandmother. A young Eleanor wearing a light summer dress, laughing brightly. And right beside her, equally young, equally radiant, was Clara. It was taken in the parking lot of the old manufacturing plant, a towering brick smokestack looming in the background. The tiny kitchen, whose window overlooked a narrow brick alleyway, smelled intensely of cinnamon and baked apples. On the table sat a ceramic teapot covered with a knitted, cozy 2 blue-rimmed teacups, and a plate holding perfectly sliced squares of apple cinnamon coffee cake. "Sit down, sweetheart," Clara said, taking the carnations and placing them in a glass vase. "Eat. It's Eleanor's recipe, by the way, though she always used way more cinnamon than the recipe called for, and she was absolutely right to do it." Sophie sat down, picked up a square of cake, took a bite, and the taste hit her like a physical blow. It was exactly the same. The same cake, the same baked apples, the heavy warmth of the cinnamon. A massive lump formed in her throat. Clara sat across from her, wrapping both hands around her teacup, and began to speak. Slowly, in a soft, melodic voice, she recounted how they had met on the factory assembly line. Both 19 years old, how they used to go to the movies downtown on Tuesday nights and get milkshakes afterward. How Clara eventually moved on to the Diamond District and Eleanor went back to school for accounting, but how they called each other every single Saturday morning. For 40 years, without fail, "She told me everything about you," Clara said, softly staring into her tea. "How you were doing in grade school. Your college graduation, how you got your heart broken for the first time in 8th grade, and sat crying at her kitchen island. She was so unbelievably proud of you. And when you got married, she was happy, of course. But she was worried. She used to tell me, 'Clara, Sophie's husband isn't an evil man, I suppose, but he lacks a backbone. He's always looking for a shortcut, and he looks at my lake house with greedy eyes.' I used to tell her, 'Oh, stop inventing trouble, Eleanor, the kids will figure it out.' But she just shook her head." Clara fell silent. She gently set her teacup down on the saucer. She told me, "Clara, if anything ever happens to me and my Sophie is in trouble, do not let her fight alone. Promise me. I have no one else to ask." The kitchen was completely silent. Outside the window, pigeons cooed and scratched against the brick sill. "I promised her," Clara said simply. And then, 2 months ago, I walked into that shop. I saw that custom clasp, the hidden cavity, the story about the holistic herbs, and then the jeweler told me the client was a guy named Mark who had a sick wife and they were trying to sell a property up in Fox Lake. Something inside me just snapped. I've been in the jewelry business for 40 years, Sophie. I have seen everything, but a dissolvable capsule hidden inside a necklace clasp. People who love their wives don't commission things like that. And then, the name Mark. The cabin in Fox Lake. It all clicked. I remembered Eleanor's warnings. I remembered her saying he was looking for a shortcut, and I knew I couldn't just walk away. Sophie sat perfectly still, her fingers tightly interlaced on her lap. The apple cake was growing cold on her plate. From the apartment next door, faint melodic music drifted through the wall, an old jazz tune, the kind her grandmother used to play on the porch radio in the summers. "You rode the bus for 3 nights, Sophie whispered, her voice cracking. "With your bad knees." "In the freezing cold." Clara waved a dismissive hand. "What knees? They've been hurting for 20 years. I'm used to it." "And the bus, that's nothing. I've survived far worse." She smiled. And in that smile, Sophie suddenly saw her grandmother. Not the physical features, not the bone structure, but something far deeper. That same quiet, indestructible strength, the kind of strength that doesn't demand applause, that doesn't seek recognition, but simply does what needs to be done because it is the right thing to do. Sophie stood up, leaned across the small table, and threw her arms around Clara. She hugged her fiercely, burying her face in the older woman's shoulder, breathing in the scent of lavender and peppermint, the exact same scent from the icy bus. And for the first time in weeks, Sophie finally broke down. She cried for the glass of cloudy, poisoned water. For the 4 agonizing days of waiting. For the sterile hallways of the toxicology lab. For Detective Miller's cluttered desk. For the black garbage bags filled with Mark's clothes. For the quitclaim deed hidden in his drawer. For the grandmother she hadn't visited enough in her final months. For the old apple tree in the yard. For everything that had almost been violently stolen from her, and wasn't all because an old woman on a city bus had kept her promise. Clara held her tightly, gently stroking her hair in silence. She didn't say a word. She just held her. Sophie never sold the property. During her next vacation block from work, while Mark's criminal trial was still making its way through the Cook County courts, she packed her bags, rented a car, and drove up to Fox Lake. She turned off the highway and drove down the familiar dirt road past the sprawling fields and the old wooden well covers. The front gate screeched exactly as it always had. The yard was wild and overgrown. The weeds were knee-high. The old apple tree had grown unruly, its branches heavy and tangled. Dandelions choked the stone pathway. Sophie walked up to the house, stepped onto the wooden porch, and slid the heavy brass key into the lock. The door resisted slightly. The wood had swollen from the humidity, but it gave way. Inside the cabin smelled of old timber dust and something faintly sweet. Maybe the jars of preserves, still sitting in the pantry. She walked from room to room, unlatching the heavy shutters one by one, pushing them open, letting the blinding sunlight flood the house. She cracked the windows. The cool lake breeze swept through the rooms, catching the white curtains with the embroidered roses that Eleanor had made by hand. Sophie stood in the middle of the kitchen looking at the heavy oak table, where her grandmother used to make apple butter. The shelves lined with mason jars. The antique wall clock that had stopped ticking years ago. The one she could never bring herself to throw away. She stayed in Fox Lake for an entire week. She bought a mower and cut down the knee-high weeds. She bought shears and pruned the wild branches of the apple tree. She bought a bucket of whitewash and painted the trunks of the fruit trees halfway up the bark exactly the way Eleanor had taught her to protect them from insects. She reorganized the closets. She threw nothing away. She simply folded everything with care. She fixed the leaking copper pipe under the kitchen sink. In the evenings, she sat on the porch in a rocking chair with a hot mug of chamomile tea, watching the sun dip below the tree line, painting the surface of the lake a deep, bruised orange. Martha came by every day. She brought homemade cookies, fresh tomatoes from her garden, or just sat on the steps to gossip. On the 3rd day, Clara drove up from the city. She was visiting relatives nearby and made the detour. The 3 women sat on the porch together drinking tea. Martha told a hilarious story about the time Eleanor had chased a stray dog out of the yard with a broom, and Clara laughed so hard she cried, adding details that Martha had forgotten. Before leaving on Sunday, Sophie walked out to the front gate. She pulled a hammer from her toolbox and nailed a beautiful custom-carved wooden plaque to the front post. She had commissioned it from a local carpenter in town. It was simple, unvarnished oak, with the letters burned deeply into the wood Eleanor's place. The plaque hung perfectly straight. The lettering was sharp, and the morning sun caught the grooves in the wood with a soft, warm light. Sophie stood back, adjusted it slightly, and ran her thumb over her grandmother's name. Then she secured the gate, slung her tote bag over her shoulder, and walked back toward her car. She drove down the dirt road past the fields, past the old wells, and she smiled. She knew her grandmother was still close. Not in any mystical, supernatural sense, but in the truest, most tangible way possible. She lived on in the sacred weight of a promise made between two friends. In the 3 miserable nights spent on a freezing CTA bus. In the hidden glass of water, pushed to the back of a kitchen drawer. In a slice of apple cake baked with too much cinnamon. And in the piercing clear eyes of an old woman in a green beret who looked at her and said, "I promised her." And I didn't let her fight alone. Sophie was starting her life over. Without fear, without looking over her shoulder. She had the key to the lake house in her pocket, and she possessed the quiet, unshakable certainty that the most valuable things in this world are not gold necklaces or $500,000 in real estate. The most valuable things are the people who keep their word even when the person they gave it to is no longer there to see it.